Okay, got it. Um, Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, good evening. It's Glenn McKnight. We're doing a recording today with Joe Catapano. He's with ICANN. He's going to do our session on actors. Just want to do a really quick, um, introduction. I've known Joe, oh gosh, I don't know how many years. How long have you been with ICANN now, Joe?
Just over 10 years. So
Oh, yeah. You know what? We probably joined around the same time.
yeah,
So here we are. I He's with the ICANN Global Stakeholder Engagement Team. It's a fantastic team. He's based in Washington with the rest of the North American team that are scattered throughout the United States. He pulls together. Now, this is the tough part of his job, I'm sure. He has to pull together people with conflicting interests and priorities. He has to pull together interested parties that are from the private sector, academia, private sector, and I assume government as well. So all of those having their own vested interest, and what Joe has to be the dance partner with all these folks to hear their concerns and educate them on what ICANN is. Joe has a past life, as he said, 10 years ago he joined ICANN, but he also was with the UN Foundation, which actually I had some work with the UN Foundation with IEEE Foundation years ago. So I'm thinking it may be when you were there. Um, he also did work with the American Association of Pharmaceutical Scientists and Pfizer. He has a MA from the American University, which is where our North American School of Internet Governance in Washington last June. So really fantastic school, one of the most prestigious schools in the US. Welcome, Joe. Thank you for joining us today. And I think this recording is going to be valuable to give insights into ICANN's role in the ecosystem.
wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Glenn, for allowing me once again to be a part of the virtual School of Internet Governance. I really appreciate it. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone, whenever and wherever you are taking this course from. It is you're really in for a treat here taking these VSIG courses. It's a very complex, somewhat large ecosystem, in terms of, that's kind of the word we use for it, internet governance ecosystem. There's a lot of different players, there's a lot of layers to some of these things and nuances. So what you're really getting here, not just with this presentation today is only a small part of it, but throughout your work at VSIG, you're really getting a comprehensive look at internet governance writ large, and hopefully you'll walk away with some tools and some skills that you can use to inform your own participation. Because I think what I really would like to get across, and I know Glenn, you agree as well, is that really the important part is showing up, and that doesn't necessarily mean in person, though it can. But a lot of this work is done through these means, right? Either video calls or conference calls or even email, lists. It's kind of interesting in terms of how policy is developed and public comment and things like that. There's a lot you can do without being physically present. And then hopefully as you grow in your stakeholder participation, you'll get a moment or two moments or maybe more where you will be in person with either with us at an ICANN meeting, or at the Internet Governance Forum, or one of the other meetings that are around. So so thank you again for the introduction. So what I'm going to talk about today are internet governance actors, right? So I work for ICANN, which stands for the Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers. I did not, this particular treatment that I have for you today is not ICANN specific, though we are a part of it, certainly. That's by design, because we are just one part of this entire ecosystem. There's only really, we have a very limited remit at ICANN. So our mission, if you will, focuses on the unique identifiers that make the internet run namely domain names, which are very familiar to you, and then internet protocol addresses, which may be less so, but those are the numbers behind each web address, and also those numbers are assigned to each device, whether that's your smartwatch or your phone or your laptop, etc., like that. So we, at the global level, coordinate those. So with that, let's move to the next slide. So I think when we talk about internet governance actors, I think it's helpful to pull back at the beginning and talk a little bit about just
Joe?
I think I may have lost you, Glenn.
Yeah, no, you're back now. I'm not sure if it was you or me, but there was a bit of a pause.
Okay, where did I lose you?
Okay, so yeah, we just started this this slide. So
okay, so as I was saying, I think when we talk about internet governance actors, I think it's important for us to pull back a little bit and talk a little bit about the history of the internet. It has not been around all that long. So the internet, right, was begun within the U.S. Department of Defense at a department called DARPA, which I believe stands for Defense Advanced Research Projects. I forget what the last name stands for. And it was mainly an academic project there. And it was dealing with packet switching and moving data from different computers and different professors, talking to each other. Many of these folks were in the academic community at the time, though they were contracted to the Defense Department to work on this particular project. So this slide gives a little bit of that kind of early history. The protocols that the internet still runs on here in 2023, right? TCP/IP, which you'll see here, which is Transmission Control Protocol and Internet Protocol, right? So that was developed in 1974. It still runs on that now, which is kind of fascinating when you think about it. And as we moved along, right, obviously the World Wide Web would be developed in the late 80s, and then would start to proliferate a little more in the early 90s. And go to the next slide, please. And so here's kind of the kind of longer tail a bit here, right? So in 98, obviously you have Google, which was a big, disruptor in the industry, maybe not immediately, but certainly within a very short period of time. It kind of supercharged the web with their abilities in search. It just so happens that same year, my organization, ICANN, was formed and incorporated in the state of California. And we'll get more to that a little bit later. And then obviously, as time went on, the internet became less of a kind of niche, research-oriented kind of project, and certainly less contained to the US and Western Europe mainly, and became more of a global resource. And it became more of a global economic engine, the likes of which we see today. And it's continued, obviously, over the years. So let's go to the next slide. So as the internet began to become what it is now, right? Became more of an economic engine, became more of something that we rely on a daily basis. There became a need, and again, I'm talking kind of in the 1990s, roughly, to think about how would we, govern this space, right? To use kind of a more informal term. What would be the right governance mechanism for a resource like the internet, or a technology like the internet that would allow it to grow and adapt to human needs, but also provide us with a framework for some basic guardrails. And what it, the short answer is it's not one size fits all, right? There needs to be kind of a good blend of different types of governance structures that help, kind of govern, in some cases regulate, the technology that we use. But for the internet, what over the years, was developed and emerged as the soundest governance model is something that is referred to as multi-stakeholder internet governance, right? Or the multi-stakeholder model. And so you can see here, and I know, Glenn kind of rattled off these groups at the top of the program, but you can see the idea is that groups from, the non-commercial sector, civil society, advocacy organizations, the private sector, business, all the names you are very familiar with, as well as smaller ones and private firms, governments, and then academics and the internet's technical community, right? The engineers, the network operators, et cetera, like that, all come into one place and have an equal seat at the table in the decision-making for how the internet is governed, right? And if you want to kind of think about the dichotomy between two different models, right? Multi-stakeholder is traditionally what we call a bottom-up process, right? So at the bottom, right, are all of the stakeholders, and the informed decision-making comes from there and then feeds up to whatever the decision-making body is, right? So in the case of ICANN, right, it's the board of directors, right? And that is as opposed to more of what top-down governance structure is, which is probably something that you're more familiar with, which is your Congress or Parliament passes a law, the president or prime minister executes the law, et cetera, like that. Or in the case of like a multilateral institution like the United Nations, right, there's a treaty, but those structures are one nation, one vote, right? So the only people at the table making the decision would be the government. Let's go to the next slide.
Next slide.
So I'll touch on this a little later in the presentation, but there are multi-stakeholder governance structures for a number of different things, not just the internet, right? It deals with climate, deals with food security, other different issues that confront humanity. But as it relates to the virtual school of internet governance and internet governance writ large, which is why you're here, it is important to recognize the importance of the World Summit on the Information Society, or you'll hear it termed WSIS, right? WSIS. This particular, well, there were two. There was one in Geneva in 2003, and then there was one in Tunis in 2005. These were seminal moments in what we term, internet governance, right? So for starters, you can see on the slide here, and I won't read it verbatim, but you can see that the WSIS provided a working definition for internet governance. It gave a little bit of form to something that was rather nebulous, back in 2005. And it was and you'll hear this as well, and you'll probably see in some of your coursework the documentation called the Tunis Agenda, right? So that comes out of the WSIS here in 2005, right? And so the formal name is the Tunis Agenda for the Information Society, and this was a consensus statement adopted by the WSIS in 2005, and it called for a few things, right? So one was the creation of the Internet Governance Forum, or IGF, which is something you may have either heard about, or I'm sure you will hear about later in your coursework. this is a multi-stakeholder gathering under the auspices of the United Nations that happens yearly, where stakeholders from those communities that we saw on the other slide gather together and discuss the most pressing issues of that particular year, right? So I know it actually just wrapped up in Kyoto a couple of weeks ago, right? And so obviously our AI, artificial intelligence, I know was a big topic of conversation there, as well as, of course, as it relates to ICANN, you know, kind of the management of critical internet resources. The other things that the Tunis agenda did is it gave, again, more definition. It gave them a newer, lightweight, multi-stakeholder governance structure for the internet. Again, something that allowed enough space for the internet for innovation, but also provided guardrails for the technology. And so the WSIS, the kind of like implementation mechanism at the international level was organized, and it was organized around kind of the themes and the action principles that came out of Geneva in 2003. So there is kind of a trend line here very early on about, you know, the direction that those that were there wanted to take this thing. And the idea was to move kind of the principles of WSIS into action, considering the work that had already been done in 03. And so largely, you know, the WSIS goals were to build kind of a people-centric, inclusive, development-oriented information society where everybody can, you know, create, share information, and use the technology, you know, for the benefit of society, right? And I think that also, again, this is somewhat outside the scope of my daily work, but another big goal of the WSIS was this kind of idea of bridging the digital divide that was continues obviously to separate rich and poor countries, but certainly 20 years ago, that gap was considerably wider than it is now. And so that was obviously a big thing for WSIS as well. And so we can move to the next slide now. Sorry.
Let me give a comment on that. I did attend Geneva in 2003 from an experience 20 years ago. And it was interesting because it was, you know, quite exciting to be involved. I was there particularly promoting free and open source software, but was interesting when they decided on the next location, which was Tunis, because Tunisia had human rights issues. Many of the same participants at Geneva actually boycotted. So it's a kind of interesting thing where these concepts, which are meant to be including civil society, you know, some decisions are being made that those voices never got heard in Tunis, and which is kind of interesting right now with IGF. They've decided to go to Saudi Arabia in the fall, and again, many people access now, and a huge number of people are boycotting that. So we're repeating our history. We don't seem to learn that we want civil society to be involved. We want their voices, but some of these decisions don't seem to work that well. So it's going to be interesting. They'll continue to go on. I highly recommend people to go to the IGF remotely. If they want to boycott the IGF in Saudi Arabia, you can still participate. You could still, run for a MAG member, all that stuff. But it's an interesting thing. I think since the internet got away from control of the technologists, it's been a bit more messy. Before, with the people with the white coats, they seemed to control it. It was very clear. They all spoke the same language. It was very much under their control. Now, all these messy civil society people with all kinds of rights and concerns and issues, it makes it a little tougher. Just my general comment.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's definitely something to that, right? I mean, when I think this goes for almost anything. You know, once you there are higher financial stakes and just broader usage and broader uptake, right? I mean, you know, when it went, as soon as it, you know, kind of left the gate from being, again, kind of this contained thing to kind of small academic communities or technical circles, and became a resource that now, however many, 5 billion people use, maybe more now. It does become a little messy because you have more, you know, actors at the table, right? Internet governance.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah, the two groups that concern me personally are the young people who grew up 100% digital. These are people who've been on gaming from the time they were 5 years old all the way through. And those that are on the other end of the spectrum, these are the people who never really connected. They worked in various different jobs. These are the seniors. And now many services and the governments have decided, saying, if you want to apply for your social security, or if you want to apply for Medicare, you know, like, it has to be online, you know. So there's a level of digital divide that's happening. On one hand, those that have really been 100% digitized, but we're not sure on their rights. And then the other far extreme, from age point of view, there's a real need for some kind of internet navigators or educators or people to help those people. So those from my perspective, from a human rights point of view, those are two people that I think needs to be addressed. I'm not sure how to do that, but I'm just bringing that up.
yeah. Yeah, no, I mean, it's a good point. It is, you know, again, it's a very complex, it's hard to negotiate and balance.
Mhm.
So now, like, let's take a look at just some, this is not an exhaustive list here, but this is some of the more, these are some of the more prominent, you know, kind of a handful of internet governance institutions, in addition to ICANN, of course, who I mentioned before, that help kind of govern the internet, right? And it's kind of, these years here are the years of formation of these institutions, right? So the International Telecommunications Union is quite old. It was formed in 1865. It is older than the United Nations by roughly 80 years.
Mhm.
And it controlled, obviously, or governed rather, you know, kind of radio waves, right, back in the day, which was obviously the emerging technology of the day. And they're still around. And it is current. So now it started out as its kind of own thing, and then obviously the UN was formed in 1945, and eventually the ITU became under the UN, right? It's a UN body. In 1986, moved to the right there, the Internet Engineering Task Force was formed, and so this comprises of, again, that technical community I talked about, right? So engineers, operators, other developers, and they develop the protocols that the internet runs on. And so we'll have examples of these later, but it's a very vitally important body, the Internet Engineering Task Force,
Mhm.
you know, because these are the guys that, you know, and girls that develop, you know, the systems that make, you know, the machines talk to each other and devices and such. If you move to the right, so in 1992, the first regional internet registry, or RIR, was formed, and that was RIPE NCC, which is the RIR for Europe, the Middle East, and certain parts of Central Asia. And so a regional internet registry, there are 5 of them, they're listed there, and they each coordinate or delegate the internet protocol addresses for the respective region.
Mhm.
And how it kind of works is, so ICANN, right, there is a affiliate of ICANN, right, which is called the Internet Assigned Numbers Authority, or IANA, and they hold the global pool of internet protocol addresses. The regional internet registries get their pool of addresses for their regions from IANA. And then they, in turn, distribute those to internet service providers and other consumers. So if you have a look here, right? So RIPE NCC in 92, APNIC for the Asia Pacific region was formed in 93. ARIN, which covers North America, the US, Canada, and the island territories of the US. That was 1997. So again, 1 year before ICANN was formed. LACNIC, which covers Latin America and the Caribbean in 99, and then AFRINIC in 2004, which covers the African continent. And before I go to the Internet Society, I just want to say, so the ITU, right, I said it's a UN body, right? So that's kind of a one nation, one vote type thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the IETF and these regional internet registries, as well as ICANN, are multi-stakeholder institutions, right? These are the folks that organize their policies in a bottom-up fashion. Then moving to the far right, and Glenn, I'm sure you'll have some commentary on this, right? We have the Internet Society, which is another important actor. It's a 501c3 nonprofit. It is I'll do my best here, and then Glenn, you can kind of add a little more color to it. I think that would be helpful, right? It's kind of part think tank, part chapter-based advocacy, right? So they do a lot of kind of studying of internet issues. They put out impact assessments and different reports about the technology, the effects of legislation on technology, things like that. They also have chapters throughout the world, which are comprised of volunteers that raise awareness on some of these internet governance issues in their communities. They can put together events. Sometimes they put together either writing or some other sort of products. An interesting way to get involved at the ground level if there is a chapter in your area. They also have a lot of virtual offerings as well. So Glenn, I'll pause. I don't know if you have any ISOC commentary. I know you're very involved.
Yeah, I was on the international board for 3 years. Plus, I started the chapter. There was no Canadian chapter, so we did that years ago. Yeah, I think it's important for people to join. It doesn't cost anything to join, and there's also not just chapters, but there's special interest groups. So if you have a particular interest in whether it's there's a special interest group for people with disabilities, which is advocating for the rights for the disabled. There's interplanetary group. There's a rural development group, and the list goes on and on and on. So it's important to know that they're out of the Internet Society. They had while I was on the board, they created the Internet Society Foundation, which had a whole bunch of bucks, a whole bunch of money that was sitting in the bank forever. And they said, we have to do something with it. So they created this special fund. So those who are listening to this, please look up the call for proposals. So if you are an academia person or advocate for something, you can put a coalition together and apply for these funds. This is way beyond the chapter funds, which is called Beyond the Net, which is a small amount of money, $5,000-$10,000, but there's significant amounts that has been researched provided by ISOC. And what was also part of ISOC was IETF. They mothered IETF. They did the financial responsibility, and they hived them off about 3 years ago. So both those two. So IETF is a separate entity. It has its own executive director and board and everything else, and so is the ISOC Foundation. Actually, the ISOC Foundation is the same board as ISOC. They just wear different hats. I'm not sure. This is a bit of a thorny issue. What's happening with AFRINIC? Is that in receivership now, or is that is the AFRINIC thing okay now?
I do not know the latest as of the recording of this. It did, I believe it did enter receivership at some point, I believe earlier in the month, but
yeah, it's a bit of a moving target. Let me ask you about the ITU. and they were at the game at the early telegraph and telephone and pretty significant group. Did they sort of miss the boat on what the internet was? So were they asleep at the switch, or because I don't understand how this group, as an international body, you would have thought they would have scooped up the responsibility of the DNS. It almost, and I'm not putting on the spot, Joe. I don't understand it. Why they sort of, not to say they didn't allow, but you would have thought they would have been at the table a lot more.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question. I mean, certainly I wasn't around, or at a bare minimum, I was very young when all this was kind of coming out. But I mean, I don't think we're breaking any news here by saying that, government doesn't move as fast as the technology, right? And it's not designed to be that way, right? So it's not necessarily a criticism. But I think it is, it's very challenging. And like what you had talked about when you were kind of giving my bio at the beginning, I worked for the UN Foundation, right? Which is not part of the UN itself, but it is UN adjacent. And I spent a lot of time in New York and working with partners at the UN on different issues, not necessarily internet related. I was doing some other work at that time, but it is very difficult to get countries aligned on anything. It's just we have different resources, we have different GDPs, we have different priorities, we have different governments, right, in terms of structure, right? Some have freer, for quote unquote freer elections and things like that than some others, right? So it's hard to kind of marshal that kind of collective energy to work on some of these things. And then, like I said, obviously the technology changes so fast,
Sure,
that it can be difficult for some of these institutions to I don't know, assert themselves in kind of a fast manner. So I guess that's the best way I can answer it.
I think it's a good answer, Joe. I'll move to the next slide for you.
Right. Okay. So here is the what I termed the house of internet governance. You want to call it floors, you want to call it layers, call it whatever you want. And it does look a little messy, which is kind of by design, because multi-stakeholder, bottom-up governance is difficult. And it is, it does bring all of these other actors in with other, kind of interests, and it takes time and it's hard work. But at the end, typically you come out with the best solution for whatever the particular problem is that you're working on, because you have the input of all these different sectors. So I know it's a little hard to see, and like the exact words in the bottom, but basically, or throughout the slide, but basically at the bottom you have kind of infrastructure and standard settings. So you have some of those protocols that I talked about that the ITF developed. You have, this, in this particular treatment, ICANN and IANA and those kind of things would be at the bottom. Some treatments have us one layer above the infrastructure. But for the purposes of this, we would kind of be more down by the foundation. And then one layer up, you have kind of jurisdiction, right? So you have, obviously, you have sovereign nations, right? And they have kind of jurisdiction over, right, the pipes that, are in country, if you will. And then you have kind of one up there, you have kind of transfer of technology, right? Cross-border data flows, things like that. And then as you get toward the top, you start to see some of those things that are more top of mind for us in terms of content, right? We can talk about whether it's social media, what's being posted on Instagram or X or whatever, but that's kind of exists at the top, right? And so, my day-to-day work doesn't touch up there, right? Like I said, ICANN's remit's very narrowly focused on the IP addresses and the domain names, right? So we kind of stay in that zone. But you know, like I said, we're just one piece of the puzzle. So there's a whole different host there. What you may hear, there's a couple of terms that would be interesting to, I want to point out that you may hear, it can be confusing. And I've heard it termed a few different ways. One is governance of the internet versus governance on the internet, right? So typically if someone's saying that, when they say governance of the internet, they're talking more kind of toward the bottom, right? Where, you know, like ICANN, ITF, that governing the resources and those kinds of things. Or certainly, you know, the flow of data, right? That would be that, as opposed to governance on the internet. And that's when you're kind of up top, right? When you're talking more about content, filtering, you know, filtering content, things like that. Another way I've heard it termed is, and this is kind of interesting. This was used, I just came back from a meeting in the North American Network Operators Group, and John Curran, who's the president and CEO of ARIN, that regional internet registry that I mentioned before, he put forth a different treatment, which you may hear from that. It sounds like, you know, the RAR community may be using this particular treatment. It's interesting. It's good to be aware of internet governance versus internet coordination. That's kind of the same thing as on and of the internet, but you know, they termed as internet governance as a broader concept that encompasses kind of the overarching norms, policies, and regulations that guide the usage of the internet. And then internet coordination refers to kind of the technical and operational management of key internet resources. And again, that's kind of the stuff that ICANN works on: domain names, IP addresses, protocol parameters, so on and so forth, right? So you may hear those different terms. You may also hear a term, technical internet governance versus just internet governance, right? It's just it's the same principle. It's just a different way of treatment, right? Technical internet governance would be governing that stuff toward at the bottom of the house, as opposed to internet governance for large. So we can go to the next slide. You can tell I like John's presentation. So this is actually a graphic that he used in his presentation. I believe it's from the OECD, the Organization Economic Cooperation Development. And I just thought it was an interesting way of looking at different ways of making policy, because internet governance is, again, it's not one size fits all. And there's policy making that happens at different levels, right? And so obviously you have these multi-stakeholder bodies like ICANN, the ITF, et cetera. You also have, this is kind of focused a little more on international, regional, and then national policy, right? So like at the bottom, you have multilateral, which is kind of a UN style, multiple countries coming together. And I'm going to go through examples of each of these things. And then you have up there, you have regional, right, which is kind of like almost like the European Union, right, where it's a region of the world. And then you have kind of bilateral, which is country to country or organization to organization. And then obviously you have unilateral, where one entity has a control of a particular portion of governance and they kind of make the decision. So we can go to the next slide. And actually you can go one more. So let's take multi-stakeholder first. All right, so this is the one that I'm the most familiar with, of course, because I've worked at ICANN for a while. This is one example of how policy is made at ICANN. So this is the kind of multi-stakeholder approach, if you will. And so the different stakeholder groups that we talked about, right? Civil society, private sector, government, academia, et cetera. They organize themselves at ICANN into two different kind of collectives, if you will, right? So there's supporting organizations, which is that blue part on the left of the slide, that develop policy. And then at the bottom, there are advisory committees, which advise the board on a particular piece of policy, right? And so there are different ways to contribute in different parts of the process, right? And so I won't go too far into detail because it gets very much in the weeds and it's a whole lecture upon itself. But for the supporting organizations, right, the regional internet registries contribute on that side through the address supporting organization. The folks that run country code top level domains like .ca or .us participate in the supporting organization capacity. And then those that run generic names, some of the ones you're familiar with, .com, .net, etc., and some of the newer ones participate in that capacity there. And then at the advisory committee level, obviously that's where the governments participate at ICANN. There's a government advisory committee, so they have input, they have advise on policy, they develop policy. We have advisory committees for security and stability, as well as for the root servers. And then we have the at-large advisory committee, which represents internet end users, which I know, Glenn, obviously you have participated robustly over the past decade. So they all kind of have, that there's a specific issue that each supporting organization will take on, right? They'll identify the issue. Again, most of this happens over conference calls or emails, video calls. They'll put together reports and they'll move through, what we call a policy development process at ICANN. There are 3 times a year that the ICANN community gets together to develop, work on policy in person. And it rotates regions around the world. There's actually one that is wrapping today. It's in Hamburg, Germany. I'm based in Washington, D.C., so it looks like it probably just is wrapped just a couple hours ago because it's a late afternoon there. And the ITF has this too. They have a few meetings a year as well. They also rotate. And that's where they basically take the work that they do over email and calls and such and do it in person and work on it. But anyway, as far as this slide is concerned in the ICANN context, policy gets developed. It goes out for public comment, right? So every ICANN policy, it's drafted, it goes it's on the website. Anybody can access it. Anybody can comment on it, right? You can comment on it as an individual. Certainly, the advisory committees within ICANN will provide commentary on policy. And then those public comments are taken into account. And the supporting organization will draft policy recommendations. It will go to the board, and then the board will, in most cases, ratify the policy, and then it will go to the organization, which is the ICANN staff, of which I am a part of, to basically implement the community's wishes. I'll pause there. Glenn, I don't know if you have anything you want to add.
Yeah, I think this is a fantastic graphic, and you have to study it so many ways to understand the process. But I strongly recommend people going to the ICANN Learn section on the ICANN website, and there's 2 or 3 courses at least on the policy process and actually get certification in that process. Well worth the exercise. It's a nice compliment. We can't get into this kind of detail because this gets really thick in the weeds to go through. But as Joe said, if there's something comes up, attend the meetings, learn the position of your ACSO, and basically go to the meetings and talk to the people who are advocating for the policy. It's a very open process. So if you are strong on a topic, this is a great way to shine.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's a good point. I dropped the address for the ICANN Learn in the chat. It's learn.icann.org. You go up there, they'll probably ask you to set up an account. It's free, and you can peruse there. There's plenty of courses there to get you warmed up. I think the other thing I'll say is before we move to the next slide is there's also an ability to participate in some of these things in an observer capacity. So if you're not quite ready to jump in with both feet, but you want to kind of get a feel, that observer capacity may be interesting to you because you can just kind of see what's going on. There's not this high pressure to contribute something. And then you can kind of see, again, kind of get a feel for what's going on, get a feel for the personalities. Maybe you connect with someone and you can talk to them offline and kind of help you get integrated.
Yep.
Yeah. All right, we can move to the next slide. So kind of reiterate what I talked about before, right? So multilateral policymaking, right, is one nation, one vote. And so those are, right, the most prominent examples of multilateral would be kind of the United Nations at the global level, right? And then, you know, entities like the European Union, there are others as well, where it's a collection of countries, but it's one nation, one vote. Next slide. So as it relates to internet governance, right, one example of a multilateral policy, as opposed to, again, the multi-stakeholder policies of the ITF and ICANN that we just went over, is the Budapest Convention on Cybercrime, right? And so that was developed by the Council of Europe some time ago. And it was the first international treaty to address cybercrime. So it was created in 2001, went into force in 2004. It attempted to do a number of things, harmonizing national laws, improving kind of techniques for investigation when it relates to cybercrime, increasing cooperation among the different countries. You know, you may remember if you were kind of around in the 90s, right? Again, the technology proliferated very quickly. There was a lot of nefarious activity out there. So the Budapest Convention criminalized some of the attacks against computers, provided some procedural tools, you know, for investigation and law enforcement, dealt with some things, you know, in terms of like copyright and you know, pornography and some other kind of thorny issues there. And it created kind of a framework, if you will, for some of these relationships among countries to share information and combat cybercrime. So that's one example. Go to the next slide. Thank you. So again, regional policymaking, right? That I'm using, there's plenty of examples out there. I'm using one that is more prominent in our space, and maybe you might have heard of it, right, in the news, maybe. So European Union in 2018, the General Data Protection Regulation went into force. I'm sorry.
No, I'm just coughing.
Oh, okay.
Sorry.
No worries.
Bye.
So generally speaking, regional policy making is also one nation, one vote, though there could be regional policies that are worked on where you have non-government entities having, you know, some kind of input. Certainly in the case of GDPR, this was a nation, you know, kind of nation state activity, collection of those, if you will. And so basically the GDPR is a law, you know, intended to protect the privacy and personal data of European Union citizens. And it applies to organizations and companies of all different shapes and sizes, kind of harmonize data privacy laws across the European Union, and imposes some obligations on organizations in terms of protecting citizens' data. It established, you know, kind of mandatory kind of rules of the road, if you will, kind of the main aspects of it, you know, kind of fair and lawful processing of information, kind of trying to limit the use of personal data down to kind of like what it is, you know, the bare necessities, if you will, what you would need company or organization would need that data for. Minimizing the use of data, retaining it in a manner that is in the best interest of kind of the user, I guess is the word I'll use. And it kind of requires kind of controllers of information to provide kind of transparent access and things of that nature. So that is kind of like one of the foremost examples of regional policymaking. Okay, then next slide, please. Bilateral, right? This is, I use this slide. It's not really policymaking per se, but it's an example of bilateral cooperation in the internet governance space amongst internet governance actors. So as I mentioned at the top, ICANN, right, there is an affiliate of ICANN called the Internet Assigned Numbers Authority, or IANA, that controls the global pool of IP addresses. We have a memorandum of understanding, or an MOU, with the Internet Engineering Task Force to perform that work. And it has been in force since March 1st of 2000, so quite some time. Memorandum of Understanding appoints ICANN to perform the IANA functions, right? And I was, kind of at the base level, as I talked about controlling the, kind of global IP space, but they also assign, IANA also assigns protocol parameters used in IETF standards, maintains the database that shows where numbers have been allocated, and so on and so forth like that. So this is an example where two multi-stakeholder bodies work together in a bilateral fashion for the benefit of internet users. So it's very important. And also, I'll just mention it, right? So the ICANN board of directors, right? They have directors from each segment of the community. The IETF also has a liaison to the board, so they have a seat at that particular capacity as well. Come to the next slide.
Okay.
And so this is kind of this is an example of unilateral policymaking, not in a. I was trying to think of something that was not Congress passes a law, which obviously is something that we can all wrap our heads around. But this little design here is the Border Gateway Protocol, or BGP. It was created in January of 1989 by the IETF, and it's an example of a multi-stakeholder organization or body kind of unilaterally putting forth a protocol, right? And it is the primary routing protocol used on the internet. It manages how packets are routed from network to network. It enables kind of peering and different network connections, and exchanges information, right? So that's an example of a multi-stakeholder body kind of putting forth a policy, and it's adopted. I mean, I think I don't want people to get confused, right? So as opposed to the kind of interesting part about this whole thing and internet governance actors and everything is that this is like the system is voluntary, right? So it's not like, right, I live in the state of Maryland, right? And in the US, and if the state government dictates that the speed limit in my neighborhood is now 25 miles an hour as opposed to 35 miles an hour, that's it, right? There is no voluntary anything with that. If I go over the speed limit and I get caught, it's against the law, I get fined. This kind of multi-stakeholder, right, policies that come out of, right, ITF, ICANN, right? Yes, like there are binding principles to it, but the governance structure works because because it has worked, right? It has been proven effective, and the internet works. And two, because people buy into it and continue to do that. And that's again where your participation will become very important. And I believe that is the part that I am going to move to here in a little bit. We go to the next slide. And go one more, please. And so again, as I mentioned at the top, right, the governance of the internet, on the internet, et cetera, like that is just one form or one area where multi-stakeholder policymaking really took hold and has really been successful. But it's not the only one where nations, organizations, societies are looking for solutions. They're like, people are looking for multi-stakeholder solutions on a number of things. There's just a few pictures of some of the areas where people are kind of clamoring for something different, something else. Maybe it moves quicker, maybe it doesn't, but something that's effective, that can get everybody kind of on the same page. If not on the same paragraph or same sentence, at least on the same page. Right. So again, things like food security, climate change, AI. In the area of climate, I was talking to some of my previous work, right? Multi-stakeholder discussion and policymaking has been used in the areas of climate for 30 years. Right. If you can go back to the Earth Summit back in 1992, the formation of the UN Sustainable Development Goals, kind of more 10, 15 years ago, the Paris Agreement on Climate in 2015, right? These are all examples of multi-stakeholder collaboration in the area of climate. Certainly the World Food Program operates on a similar kind of domain in terms of that, in terms of finding solutions. And now, of course, a ton of discussion on AI, as there should be. Obviously, AI is not an area that ICANN touches on, but certainly trying as societies try and wrap their heads around the technology and what's the best path forward, right? People are looking to for multi-stakeholder frameworks to try and help out a bit. And certainly bringing the different actors to the table, not just the companies that run the technology, not just the governments where the citizens live, but also the civil society actors that are kind of looking at human rights and things like that, as well as obviously academics and end users, is very critically important. Next slide. So here's the fun part. How can you be involved? I'll say at the top that all of these organizations, maybe not all, but most of them have opportunities for participation through the form of fellowships, scholarships, things of that nature. I do for sure know that the regional internet registries do. I believe the IETF does as well. And then obviously Glenn had mentioned, the Internet Society has kind of their grant program that they're working on there. For ICANN, right, for a newcomer, right, we have a lot of resources here for you, right? I dropped the learn.icann.org in there. That's a good way to start, kind of do a little more of this, right? Learn through some of our online courses. I did mention at one point that ICANN meets 3 times a year for public meetings, right? And to that end, we have programs that can help newcomers, people interested in internet governance, interested in ICANN, get them to the meeting. So there's 2, right? So the fellowship is the only real requirement is you have to be over the age of 21. And the fellowship, right, you apply through our website, and then it fully funds you to get to the ICANN meeting. Your lodging is taken care of. They give you a small stipend as well for the duration of the meeting. It is a comprehensive program of work. My colleague Siranush does an excellent job with the fellows of giving them a real kind of beginning to end orientation. You work with a mentor, you get to kind of learn and then sit in on some sessions. There's a public forum at 2 of the 3 meetings that we have a year where you can get up, make some comments. So that's a great program there. The other program that we have is called the Next Gen program. It's very similar to the fellowship, slightly different, in that you need to be enrolled at an institution of higher learning, and you need to be between the ages of 18 and 30. And you need to reside in the region that the ICANN meeting is taking place. So, for instance, the next is going to be in San Juan, Puerto Rico, which for ICANN's purposes is in North America. And so you would need to, for instance, be enrolled in a college in either the US or Canada, or on one of the islands as well that are under the North America region ICANN. And so those are the two kind of main programs to kind of get you integrated into that. And I'm sure, Glenn, in whatever materials you provide for the students, you can provide the website for both those programs, because it'll have all the deadlines, because we do plan a little far out for both those things. So stay tuned to that for the next opportunities. And I think with that, that's all I have. I don't know if there's any kind of general questions or commentary or anything else I can help with for the crew that's going to watch this.
Yeah, no, this is great. Just my general observation as a person who's been in the selection committee on many organizations and meeting a lot of the next gen and fellows. It's a big difference. If you're a person that likes to get, trips paid for and you go from one group to the next, it really shows, because, you don't really have an interest. But if this is your passion, get, attend virtually or in person other ICANN meetings, regardless to fellow or next gen, to know what you're talking about. The last thing we want to see is people doing a cut and paste and have no clue what it is. You got to find what your niche is. If you're a person that's a lawyer from your country and you're interested in particularly the IP law or copyright or human rights, or if you're a person that's deeply involved with the digital divide issues, that's a passion for you. And you should know who in the ecosystem you can be mentored by or getting involved. But just to show up to get a fellowship or next gen is a disservice, not only to yourself, but to people who should be there. And I hate to be judgmental. I must be getting old. But I'm getting a little intolerant to people just, oh, here's an opportunity for me. And I call them junkies. But generally speaking, I almost 100% everyone's good. They get it. They understand. They're there for a commitment, and it's nice to see, because some people join on the fellowship or next gen, and then next thing you know, they move up, they volunteer within the community, and there's been many examples of people who have become board members. Moving through the system. So it's a really great way to start.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I would say too, before we wrap, it's great. It's a great way to find out what your, area of interest is. It's a great way to grow your network, right? Do I want everybody that participates in the fellowship to become an active ICANN policy person? Sure. Do they have to be? No.
No.
What you may meet, you may meet, you never know who you're going to meet. Is what I'm trying to say. Right? You make connections. Maybe they, maybe it's the connection for your next job, whatever that is. Right? Or maybe it's just a really great friend, right? So these are kind of important, I think, kind of aspects of what our programs provide. And I really encourage everyone to take a look at it.
Right. Well, this has been great, Joe. I thought it was really important to go through all of this from your perspective. And actually, in many ways, it was like a conversation with you and me. And I think it's less pressure, and, you just let it flow. And I think this recording will be valuable to all the students before and after. And I'll send you the link. It will be part of our playlist. and I'll be pushing it on the discussion thread as well. But it's been very informative, and I think it's very, very critical part of our program in terms of, because ICANN fits in with so many elements of our 11 modules. It's not just the actors, but I think you did a really great deep dive, and so it's been great. So again, we like to thank you on behalf of myself and everybody else on that's part of our team and our advisory council, and we look forward to see you hopefully in Puerto Rico in February.
Absolutely, my friend. Thank you.
Thanks again, Joe. Bye bye.